I'm the Reverend Tim Hughes Williams. I'm the pastor here at Light Street Presbyterian Church. And my part is really easy. I just get to say that it's such an honor to host this event and to let the people in the room know that the restrooms are downstairs underneath the staircases. So if you need to avail yourself of one of those, help yourself, and there are refreshments right over there. And if you're joining us online, feel free to travel to your own kitchen and restroom as needed. But please know that we are so happy to have you with us on this special occasion. And I'll turn it over to Kenny Walker.
Thank you, Pastor Tim. And thank you for allowing us to be here at Light Street Presbyterian and for hosting us today. We do appreciate it. Welcome, welcome, welcome to our 5th annual Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Performing Arts and Spoken Word Contest. It's presented by the Presbyterian of Baltimore and our ministry group, the ITL, which is the In the Loop Ministry Group, which is one of 6 ministry groups in the Presbyterian of Baltimore. And the reason we have our name is that we call it the In the Loop because it's within the Baltimore Beltway. So today, we are here to celebrate the life of Dr. Martin Luther King and to have our community, our churches express how they feel about Dr. Martin Luther King. And our topic for this year is Dr. Martin Luther King and his role and the role that he played in fair housing movement. While most people are aware of Dr. Martin Luther King as civil rights movement leader, few are familiar with the role he played in the fair housing movement. During the early 20th century, Black Americans were systematically deprived of sufficient quality housing because they were routinely and openly excluded from living in certain areas. Discrimination, intimidation, exclusion, and even violence segregated and delegated Black people to low-income areas with poor quality housing. In his role as civil rights leader, Dr. King recognized that this reality as a core component of racial injustice in the United States and decided to take action in response. Well, Dr. King wasn't able to see his actions into fruition because 1 week after his assassination, the Fair Housing Act was signed into law. Today, over 50 years since Dr. King's assassination and the passage of the Fair Housing Act, there is still a lot left to achieve in the realm of fair housing. While we have made strides thanks to the efforts of the civil rights activists, the need for such advocacy has far from disappeared. So this Dr. Martin Luther King Day, this weekend, we are inspired to continue to fight for equality and justice as exemplified by Dr. King, particularly in fair housing and through the use of things like civil rights testing. I don't know if you guys are aware, but not too long ago, the mayor of Baltimore has pledged to fight the vacant housing that's in the city of Baltimore. So that fight still continues. Now I would like to introduce Annette Snyder from Huntington Ridge Presbyterian Church as we continue. Thank you.
Thank you, Kenny. So before we get to the business of the day and listen to all of our wonderful contestants' entries, we are going to have a keynote speaker, and I'd like to introduce Ms. Sharice Jordan Moore to introduce our speaker.
Good afternoon. I'm Sharice Jordan Moore, a ruling elder at Knox Presbyterian Church and co-chair of the Presbyterian of Baltimore's Dismantling Racism team. In 1965, Dr. King, working with the Chicago Freedom Movement, identified discrimination in housing as one of the three main issues of the civil rights movement, along with discrimination in education and in employment. As Kenny told you, the Fair Housing Act was passed shortly after Dr. King's death in 1968. Housing continues to be an issue facing Baltimore and, in fact, the whole country still in 2024. Reverend Andrew Connors, senior pastor at Brown Memorial Presbyterian Church and moderator of the Presbyterian of Baltimore, is a local leader who is carrying the mantle for fair housing in Baltimore. Through his work with Build and a faith-based organizing group in Baltimore. Join with me in listening as Reverend Connors shares his thoughts on this important work.
In the mid to late 1960s, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. built a diverse coalition of stakeholders to address the issue of housing inequity. The Fair Housing Act of 1968 was a key housing win that came out of this coalition. Yet the overall injustice that Dr. King directed us all to address still remains one of the key justice issues of our time. It's good to be with you all today, even if it has to be from a video over Zoom. For as long as I've been alive, I have watched leaders in the city of Baltimore pursue a strategy of investment in downtown with the promise to us and to our neighbors that the wealth invested there will eventually fill the pools of prosperity up so high that they will overflow uptown in the form of jobs and safety and education and health. Now, from the prophetic warnings of our faith traditions, we've known for a long time that this trickle-down investment wouldn't happen. So we did our best to make our own way. In the Build organization, of which I'm a part, we fought for and won the first living wage ordinance in the country at a time when manufacturing jobs were leaving our city. We fought for $1 billion for schools at a time when those buildings were crumbling. And we raised our own money, $10 million, to rebuild East Baltimore in the neighborhoods of Oliver, Broadway East, Greenmount West, and now Johnson Square, to show others who didn't believe what was actually possible. In these neighborhoods, I'm happy to report legacy homeowners gained wealth without losing their homes. That's key. The murder rate was cut in half, and people who had moved out of the city moved back in. And along the way, we worked with 5 different mayors and 3 different governors, because we know that to rebuild neighborhoods, it takes more than any one leader working alone. It takes all of us working together in the spirit of Nehemiah toward a vision that can outlast any one of us. Through our East Baltimore work, we demonstrated that when you invest in neighborhoods in the right way, eliminating all those abandoned houses, strengthening neighborhood leaders to make their own decisions about what's best for their own neighborhoods, you should expect to get a return on your investment that more than pays for itself. Yet, Presbyterian of Baltimore, for generations, we have not just ignored whole neighborhoods in our city. We have stripped wealth and denied investment. We have bulldozed entire communities to make room for the highway that leads to nowhere, just a few blocks from where I live and where I'm recording now in Southwest Baltimore. That's why Build fought for and negotiated with Mayor Brandon Scott and the Greater Baltimore Committee for a commitment to invest in the neighborhoods at a scale that has never been seen before, because we believe in the people of Baltimore, the people who already live here. Now, as part of this agreement, all the parties agree that the scale of the problem in our city requires a public investment of a minimum of $3 billion over 15 years to address at least 37,500 properties directly, with a pathway to public investment of 45,000 properties if that's needed. This is investment that uses a whole block strategy that eliminates every vacant house on every block. The outside housing and finance experts that Build, Mayor Scott, and the GBC hired together, some of the foremost experts in the country, trusted in Annapolis, have demonstrated to us that every dollar that the government invests in this community-driven whole blocks approach will generate $2 more in direct dollars from the private sector. That's enough capital to rebuild all of our neighborhoods one block at a time. Some of those same experts have demonstrated for us, using conservative assumptions, that this approach not only pays for itself. You can see in this graph right here, over 20 years, this investment will result in $3.5 billion in new tax revenue for the city and the state. Over 30 years, that number grows to $7.4 billion. Did you hear that? $7.4 billion in new tax revenue without displacing any current resident. In fact, building their wealth, which is one of the key issues of racial justice in our country. $7.4 billion, all because we decided collectively to believe and invest in Baltimore. But the costs of not investing in our neighborhoods will leave us on a continued pathway to disinvestment, abandonment, crime, and decline. Together, the parties involved in this historic agreement have identified the needed sources of funding, with ideas for where even more could be found, the need for an existing special purpose entity to secure that funding, and the values of community-led development. These values are key: community-led development, non-displacement, and a whole block approach required to get this right. Now, we know from Dr. King's history of building diverse coalitions to make unprecedented civil rights gains that big things can happen when we come together and agree on shared interests. In fact, the last time Build came together with the mayor of Baltimore and the Greater Baltimore Committee, we created the College Bound Foundation, a scholarship program that has invested in tens of thousands of our young people as the future leaders that they are. In fact, one of those investments was in a young up-and-coming leader named Brandon Scott, who is now the mayor, now cutting this next unprecedented deal. When we all show up together, God shows off. Yet despite this historic agreement, beloved, I can promise you that even before some of the naysayers have looked at any of the data behind this proposal, they will have already dismissed it. We've been told for so long that if you give money to downtown, it's an investment. But if you give money to uptown, it's a handout. We've been told for so long that the problem with our city is the people who live in it, not the racist redline policies that were designed to disinvest from Black neighborhoods in the first place. We've been told for so long that the city can't run its own police department or school system or government that we hardly notice whose interests that story serves. Even now, we're hearing harebrained proposals that cutting property tax rates without a plan for investing in our neighborhoods is going to save the city, when we know from our history that urban renewal plans like that just give more money to the rich so they can bulldoze our neighborhoods and take our land. That's why it's so important when we all hear people say we cannot afford big housing plans that the community is pushing for in these budget-strapped times, that you remember that this is an investment that will more than pay for itself. We have the data now to prove it, not just from the 3 neighborhoods that we've actually rebuilt without displacing anyone, but from the foremost housing experts in the country. We've known that rebuilding our city without displacing residents is the best path forward to build one Baltimore together. It's like Dr. Ibram X. Kendi pointed out in his book, Stamped from the Beginning, The Definitive History of Racist Ideas in America. When anti-racist policies have advanced in our history, guess what? It's benefited everybody. This is not a matter of whether or not we have the money. It is a matter of the priorities of our public officials. Because here's what we know on this Martin Luther King Jr. weekend. If we can find close to $1.5 billion in lean times for our football and baseball teams, go Ravens, go O's, bonding that requires a recurring revenue stream at the state level, bonding that requires a special purpose entity, exactly the things that our neighborhoods will need. If we can find hundreds of millions of dollars in public money for the Inner Harbor for a second time, then surely we can also find the money for a first-time investment in our neighborhoods. Beloved, the time to build one Baltimore is now. May God give us the strength and the vision and the wisdom and the grit and the faith to prioritize our calendars, to match up to the things we say we believe about our gracious and just God. May God bless all of you. If you want to learn more about this specific housing proposal, you can go to buildonebaltimorenow.org.
All right, now after that wonderful keynote, we're going to start hearing from our entries. Just so that you know, we have entries in 4 categories: elementary school, middle school, and high school, as well as adults. And first, we're going to hear from one of our adults, Mr. Christopher Watson.
Hello, good afternoon, and happy MLK weekend. I want to join Tim and welcome you all here. I'm a ruling elder here at Light Street Presbyterian Church, and we are thrilled to be hosting this event this year. This year, as Kenny said, our Performing Arts Contest focuses on Dr. King's work and legacy in the fight for fair and affordable housing. To use Dr. King's words, God never intended for some individuals to live in superfluous and inordinate wealth while others live in abject poverty. Yet here we stand in Baltimore City, where the median household income is less than 60% of that of the state of Maryland, the second wealthiest state in the United States by that metric. It's not hard to see how this came to pass. when you start to dig into the history of housing and zoning policies in Baltimore, like the ones that Andrew was just telling us about. I'm sure you are all aware of the history of redlining in the city. The results of these policies are stark, and being here in South Baltimore, I wanted to share a specific example of the impact that they have had, as demonstrated by one study that was conducted in the early 1980s and reported by the Maryland Historical Society in 1982. First, I'm going to talk a little bit about stability. In the period from 1928 to 1977, 83.2% of the families living in the majority white neighborhood of Locust Point occupied the same property for at least 20 years. In majority black Sharp Leadenhall, just down the road from this church, that number was 22.7%. Likewise, the vacancy rate over that same period in Locust Point was 1.5%, whereas in Sharp Leadenhall it was 31%. There was not a single property in Locust Point that remained vacant for the entirety of that 50-year period. There were 17 properties that were vacant for the entirety of that 50-year period in Sharp Leadenhall. And many of those properties were owned by the city because they had been forfeited due to default on property taxes. This disparity is made all the more dramatic when you realize that the people living in these two communities had the same educational background. They were working the same jobs at the same companies. You cannot account for this disparity by anything other than the disparity in the housing policies in these two different neighborhoods. And by the end of that study period, 300 of the houses in Sharp Leadenhall had been bulldozed. And more than 3,000 of the people in that predominantly and historical black neighborhood had been displaced to build what is now I-395 in the name of urban renewal. Locust Point was spared. It was not just housing that was impacted by the road. It was also the community resources. Just a decade earlier, in 1956, the B&O Railroad needed some more space to expand, and the first school in Baltimore that had been built for black children was demolished. When I-395 was built, 2 more schools serving this black community were demolished, and they were replaced by Sharp Leadenhall Elementary School, which was also just now, last year, demolished. The community playground was also razed, and it was replaced by Solo Gibbs Park, which is, as some of you know, a continuing subject of community organizing because ever since it was built, it has also been relatively disinvested compared to other green spaces in the city. Dr. King's legacy teaches us that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And this has played out in so many ways in this city. Andrew was just telling us about the economic impact, the loss of potential tax revenue that we get as a direct result of these policies. And that affects everyone who lives in or is connected with the city. And it also reinforces what we know, which is that we have to work together to put pressure on elected officials and policymakers, especially local elected officials and policymakers, to make changes in these policies. So, to use Dr. King's words once again, now is the time to make real the promises of democracy. Now is the time to open the doors of opportunity to all of God's children. Now, I could talk on and on and on about the way that these policies have impacted people. But what I'd like to do is let the people who were impacted speak for themselves. So I'm now going to play just a short clip from a documentary about the Sharp Leadenhall neighborhood and how the construction of the highway affected them. Thanks.
everybody knew everybody. This is what it was. If you live next door to me, I know you.
I mean, you could walk from one house to the other, smell food. Come on in here, y'all want something to eat. This is how we were. We could go in the house and eat.
We had right on the corner where you see that sign right there, we had a store there. They sell all kinds of things. What called was fish buying store.
You know, it was markets, it was stores, you know, lunchrooms and so forth.
Some of them worked at Domino Sugar. Some of them worked at Domino Sugar. Some of them worked Spurs Point.
So we had a little dance hall. The lady's name was Susan May Terry. She had a dance place, and we lived on the second floor.
We would go in there and didn't have enough money for our medicine. And it was okay with him. We could get our medicine. He knew us. He knew
And it was, you know, it was nice during that time because we loved everybody.
When you work and play and sing, you be proud.
This community is called Sharp Leadenhall, but it hasn't always been called that, and it hasn't always been confined to just a few small blocks of South Baltimore. Sharp Leadenhall is what remains of the first African-American neighborhood in Baltimore, founded by freed slaves just a few blocks north of here in 1790. By 1832, it had become a center of black culture. Frederick Douglass was a member of the neighborhood's Sharp Street AME Church. After the Civil War, the community expanded south from Pratt Street, wedging some 4,200 mostly black residents between the B&O railroad yards and the harbor. Known by residents simply as South Baltimore, it remained a poor but stable community of workers and their families until the 1930s, when the city rezoned it to permit nearly unrestricted commercial and industrial use alongside residential properties. Hilda Singleton grew up in South Baltimore during that period.
And also somewhere around here, they would have a place called a bathhouse, and you could go take a bath. It was like that. That's how it was down here. You pay a little something to get a bath. You didn't have to go dirty.
My mother and them rented a room. You know, this was like a rooming house. And we slept in one room where she had 3 beds in there. My mother and my father. I had a bed by myself, but I was the oldest girl. So that means my brothers, my 3 brothers, they had a bed. So they slept in that bed.
Neglected by a city preoccupied with expanding to the north and west, services in South Baltimore remained rudimentary for decades.
This was during the 50s. They had the outhouses in the back. It was wooden outhouses. Although they had running water, they had toilets inside, you know, and it was most of the yards was dirt. It was very little pavements, you know, on the streets.
So dirt.
Yeah,
dirt roads.
you had a lot of dirt roads.
We didn't have no whole lot of help down here. And if we had voting people, we didn't know nothing about them because they was in their own districts down here. We didn't have anybody around exactly in here. They were all down like the 4th Avenue area if we had anybody. They were down in that area, the councilman or whoever was, and they never bothered about nothing up here.
By the late 1960s, city, state, and federal officials decided to do away with the neighborhood altogether. It would be bulldozed to make room for the new highway, Interstate 95.
The thing that seemed most positive was to run the big highway through here, the interstate. Run it right through the middle of Sharp Leadenhall, run it up across what is now Montgomery Street, up over the top of Federal Hill, across the harbor, down into Fells Point.
The city came in, you know, and bought out. So that's how we ended up moving.
We had to move out because the city bought the houses. They bought the house. The city, we got the letter saying the city bought your house, and you will have to move. We will pay you to move. They tell you such and such a time when the meeting going to be.
Then they said the highway's coming through and you gotta move. I said, oh God.
The city bought houses in the neighborhood, evicted longtime renters, and created a swath of vacant homes through the middle of the neighborhood that was 2 blocks wide and at least 14 blocks long. The whole neighborhood would have been destroyed by community activists who were able to get the path of the highway moved.
Ultimately, because of community pressure, collective community pressure, the route of that road was changed. But the damage had been done because properties had been acquired, people were moved out of those homes that they had lived in.
When the dust settled around 1978, The neighborhood still stood, but barely. 360 houses had been razed. 3,000 residents had been displaced. Only 500 holdouts remained in the wreckage of Baltimore's oldest African-American community. The city leaders who had helped create this virtual wasteland then designated it an urban renewal area. They cut the remains of Black South Baltimore in two, calling the northern section Inner Harbor West and the southern section Sharp Leadenhall. The city acquired any remaining private property in Inner Harbor West and then sold it cheaply to developers and individual homeowners who pledged to invest thousands of dollars to rebuild the area. The poor black families renting in Inner Harbor West were forced out, many of them veterans of the highway displacement just a few years before.
The highway was coming, through, and you had to move, and then they built the houses up. But then everybody got in the houses with rich folks or white folks. You couldn't go back to stay. That's what I didn't like. I didn't like that.
And after they bought the houses, they fixed them up like a mansion. Beautiful houses.
Like Lee Street. They built Lee Street all up, and I moved from there. When you go down there and look at it, now you wouldn't even believe that.
And the rent was so high, they know we couldn't afford it. So that's that. They took our houses away.
Inner Harbor West became Otterbein, an upper-middle-class enclave that is 75% white.
I remember the time we couldn't walk down this way after they had got it, They didn't want you in the neighborhood, tell the truth about it. So, we come through here, they would, we had a lady that lived in Bourbon Street, and she come through here, they sick the dog on you if you walk down this way.
Excluded from Otterbein, neighbors set about improving what was left to them. 10 years' worth of community pressure finally convinced officials to follow through on a promise to provide 190 subsidized and 25 public housing units in Sharp Leadenhall. In the 1990s, residents started owning their own property.
Part of the city's promise to this community was the building of some affordable home ownership housing. We had to mount a campaign to press the city to come forward with this money that had promised for probably 15 or 20 years. And we persuaded the city to keep its promise. So this enabled low and moderate income families to purchase these homes. They got a really good deal.
Linda Davis bought one of the houses.
I'm going to be here permanently. And when I rented, I didn't know where I would end up. So now I know that I have a permanent place. So it is a different feeling. It really is. It's a feeling of belonging. I always felt like I belonged to the neighborhood. My grandmother was born in 1989, and her grandmother raised her down here. And I lived in 106 Cross Street, and now I live 130. And now I'm back in the same neighborhood that I was born in. It feels good.
Today, neighbors continue to improve Sharp Leadenhall through a planning committee that runs a youth rec league, beautifies streets, organizes resident advocacy groups, and holds politicians to promises they've made. A key concern right now of the committee is the city's management of public housing.
So now we're going to hear from a couple of our youth entries. We have two from elementary school, Ray Ruff and Xavier Adams will be next.
My name is Ray Ruff, and I am 9 years old. My poem is about Dr. King and his dream for homeless people. Who is MLK? We know him as Martin Luther King Jr., a third-generation preacher after his grandfather and father. He was a person who tried to help end racism. His work would help whites and blacks be treated the same. Today, they almost are. Dr. King had the guts to say, "I have a dream." He wanted to help everyone. Today, I think he would say, if there are empty houses and people who are homeless, why are we not giving them the houses, helping and caring for the community? I want to follow his example. I have a dream that there will be no such thing as a homeless person. I hope you can follow Dr. King's example too. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Xavier Adams from PS316 in Brooklyn, New York, and I'm in 4th grade and 9 years old. Today we're going to be talking about how Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was a great civil rights leader ever. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was a great civil rights leader because he led the civil rights movement, and also he spoke up for us. One area he worked on was fair housing for black people. He moved to Chicago and found out that housing wasn't fair for black people because white people had big houses and they didn't have to pay a lot of money. But for black people, they had small houses and they didn't have enough hot water, and they had rats in their houses, and also they had to pay a lot of money for their houses. So Dr. King moved his family to Chicago to live among the poor black people who had horrible housing to show that he cared. Dr. King worked to change the law. The new law was called the Fair Housing Act of 1968. Unfortunately, the law wasn't signed by the president after 6 days after Dr. King was killed. The new law didn't fix all housing problems for black people, but it helped a lot. The Fair Housing Act of 1968 is still important today because it helps with unfair housing, not just for black people, but for everyone. Bye!
It is wonderful to get the fresh perspective of young people. Our next entry is actually from myself. Before we watch it, I just want to make a few remarks. We know that where we live matters. Since Africans were forcibly removed from Africa and lived in the fortresses and the dungeons on the coast before the Middle Passage and having to survive or die, in the bowels of slave ships, before having to live in slave quarter cabins, and even after slavery and Reconstruction, sharecropper cabins, and then migration to the northern slums. Housing has always been an issue for black people in America. MLK knew this and he acted on it. Unfortunately, it took his death in 1968 to usher in the Fair Housing Act. But this is not just history. The struggle still continues. It impacts our life opportunities. It impacts health, education, and opportunities for employment. We know that home ownership is a path to generational wealth, so this remains an important issue. Politics based on racism and capitalist economics have been a major factor in shaping what our communities look like. So what I'm hoping my offering next will help us understand that this is a consequence for people's real lives, and I just have a little bit to say about some things I experienced as a young person in Baltimore. A Tale of Two Baltimore Neighborhoods by Annette Snyder. West Baltimore. A highway to nowhere? Well, it was somewhere to me. When I was a girl, my grandma lived there. Eminent domain, they said, for the betterment of the community, they claimed. But it felt more like imminent domain, because by the time you heard about it, it was already happening. And it was happening to you, not for you. Grandma was proud of her home on Arlington Avenue. She'd have my brothers scrub her front stairs till they gleamed in the sun. A little bamboo cleanser, a pail of water, a stiff brush and some elbow grease. Good for growing boys and great for the cool, smooth marble. There was a clothesline with a pulley from the second floor window. You could see the bright white sheets airing in the sun and billowing in the breeze. Fresh. In the backyard, there was a pond with huge goldfish that I could watch for hours, but was never allowed to be left near alone. Friends would gather in the yard, in the kitchen, or in the club basement, where it was cool for an ice-cold beer. Grandma's sister, Aunt Pearl, lived next door, and most Sundays, Aunt Lillian, who lived a few blocks away, walked from her home to Grandma's house to see her sisters. We'd sit out front on the wooden, orange and black, slat-back rocking chairs and visit with the neighbors in the coolness of the evening after a long, hot, and humid Baltimore summer day. The highway to nowhere displaced hundreds. We were neighbors. We were a community. We were a family. Forest Park. In 1962, in the middle of the fourth grade, we moved to Forest Park. Mama always wanted us to live where she thought we would be safer and perhaps go to a better school. But something happened. By the time sixth grade started, 1964, they were all gone. The Jewish kids who had to leave school early at the end of the school day to go to Hebrew school, and the teachers who taught me, Miss Jewell and Miss Faber, were gone. The synagogue on the corner was now a Baptist church, as was the one a block down the street. No more Arundel ice cream store. No more Silver's Bakery with their delicious glazed donuts. No little storefront shoe shop with the nice older couple. The Reach drugstore and the bowling alley, never rebuilt after a fire, too were gone. After the departure, there was at Baltimore Colts' Jim Parker's Lounge, a sub shop, and a record store. The neighborhood filling station where my brother pumped gas is still there. The departure was planned and it was fast. The change was profound. Thank you. Our next contestants are two of our middle school entries. A video by Malia Harris, which is dance, and then a poem and a sculpture by Daniel James.
And I'm in the sixth grade. My name is Molly Harris, and I'm in the sixth grade at Loch Raven Technical Academy in Towson, Maryland, and I'm in the Magnet Visual Arts program. I'm also a dance student at the Ballet Nouveau School in Baltimore, Maryland. When I read about Harriet Tubman and saw the movie Harriet about how she freed the slaves, I thought about our enslaved ancestors. In the song Stand Up, the words stand up, take my people with me, together we are going to our brand new home, should remind everyone that being free in God's eyes means living free. We should stand up for what we believe in. Because of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s work, many of us have fair and affordable housing, and we should be able to live wherever we want to, even in a brand new home. We still need people like Harriet Tubman and Dr. King to help us fight for our freedom. I hope everyone enjoys my dance performance to Stand Up by Cynthia Erivo. I hope to perform in person next year. Congratulations, everyone.
I've been walking with my face turned to the sun. Weight on my shoulders, a bullet in my gun. Oh, I got eyes in the back of my head, just in case I have to run. I do what I can when I can, while I can for my people. While the clouds roll back and the stars fill the night, that's when I'm gonna stand up, take my people with me. Together we are going to a brand new home, far across the river. Can you hear freedom calling, calling me to answer? Gonna keep on keeping on. I can feel it in my early in the morning, before the sun begins to shine, we're gonna start moving towards that separating line. I'm waiting for mighty waters. You know I gotta make up mind. And I don't mind if I lose any blood on the way to salvation. And I'll fight with the strength that I got until I die. So I'm gonna stand up, take my people with me. Together we are going to a brand new home, far across the river. Can you hear freedom calling, calling me to answer? Gonna keep on keeping on. And I know what's around the bend might be hard to face 'cause I'm alone. And I just might fail, but Lord knows I'll try. Shine stars fill up your sky. Stand up, take my people with me. Together we are going to a brand new home, far across the river. Can you hear freedom calling, calling me to answer? Gonna keep on keeping on. I'm gonna stand up, take my people with me. Together we are going to a brand new home, far
Hi, my name is Daniel James, and I'm from Baltimore, and I attend Cross Country Elementary Middle School. And this is a sculpture from Washington, D.C. in the Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial. It's the yeah, it's the sculpture of it. So yeah, I'll be reading about Martin Luther King Jr. So, a courageous man in faith, born on January 15, 1929, in Atlanta, Georgia. This man was the most important man, not only delivering his "I Have a Dream" speech, but having an impact on all of our lives. Dr. King fought for equal rights for all when giving chances on housing, as many were living in old slumps and poor housing. As Dr. King once said, out of a mountain of despair, a stone of hope. That hope was to fulfill the American dream of rights and colored people, changing and giving affordable housing as being on one of the most components of racial justice and equality. His changes opened up doors to housing for a brighter future that we did not ask for. Justice and equality, to me, represents the racial inequalities at the time, but represents justice and equality because he said all men are created equal, and we should fulfill that for Martin Luther King. Thank you.
Our next offering will be by the Reverend Deborah McCackron. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Deborah McCackron. I'm the pastor at Hunting Ridge Presbyterian Church, and it's a treat for me to be able to be here with you all. I am not a poet, but I decided to challenge myself and write a poem for this event today. So in 1967, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. addressed students and faculty at Stanford University in California with a speech that he entitled, "The Other America." He touched on many ways that there are two Americas. There's a white America, and there's another America for everyone else. 66 years ago, he described what he called then a dangerous trend, watching our center cities becoming predominantly black, ringed by white suburbs. The stark contrast among Baltimore neighborhoods is a glaring example. My poem pulls out some of King's language from that speech as I reflect on his insistence that fair housing is central to creating one America. King's Other America. I'm in a place covered in shade, carefully tended container gardens, cars new and expensive. Crossing the street, I find a different environment. I enter a place with cement, cigarette wrappers, candy boxes. It's all about color. Color defines too many neighborhoods. It's the other Baltimore, the black butterfly. Trendy housing for young white people up the middle, flanked by wings of decaying black neighborhoods where he says, life is a long and desolate corridor with no exit signs. Habits of separation baked in, patterns of discrimination accepted. What has changing a law done? He says that a law can't change hearts, but it can change habits. Has it? Has it changed the amount of available wealth needed to keep a house whole? Has it changed the attitude of the realtor who still only works in some neighborhoods? Color defines too many neighborhoods. When will we ever learn that our hearts have to change too? When will we ever learn? Thank you.
Okay, so we have our final two entries by two high school students, Brianna James and Santos Snyder.
Hello, my name is Brianna James, and I'm 15 years old, and I attend Coppin Academy High School. On April 11, 1968, President Lyndon Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act of 1968. The 1968 Act expanded on previous acts and prohibited discrimination concerning the sale, rental, and financing of housing based on race, religion, national origin, sex, and, as amended, handicap and family status. The act is also known as the Fair Housing Act of 1968. The enactment of the Federal Fair Housing Act on April 11, 1968 came only after a long and difficult journey. From 1966 through 1967, Congress regularly considered the Fair Housing Bill, but failed to gain a strong enough majority for its passage. However, when Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated on April 4, 1968, President Lyndon Johnson utilized this national tragedy to urge for the bill's speedy congressional approval. Since the 1966 open housing marches in Chicago, Dr. King's name had been closely associated with the fair housing legislation. President Johnson viewed the act as a fitting memorial to Dr. King's life work. Another significant issue during this time period was the growing casualty from Vietnam. The deaths in Vietnam fell heaviest upon your poor African American and Hispanic infantrymen. However, on the home front, these men's families could not purchase or rent homes in certain residential developments on account of their race or national origin. Specialized organizations like NAACP, the National Association of Real Estate Brokers, the GI Forum, and the National Committee Against Discrimination and Housing Lobbies are for the Senate to pass the Fair Housing Act and remedy in this inequity. Senators Edward Brooke and Edward Kennedy of Massachusetts argued deeply for the passage of this legislation. Senator Brooke, the first African American ever to be elected to the Senate by popular vote, spoke personally of his return from World War II and an ability to provide a home and his choice for his new family because of his race. With the city's rioting after Dr. King's assassination, the destruction mounted in every part of the United States. The words of President Johnson and congressional leaders rang the bell of reason for the debate for the House of Representatives, who subsequently passed the Fair Housing Act. Without debate, the Senate followed the House in its passage of the act, which President Johnson signed into law. The power to appoint the first officials administrating the act fell upon President Johnson's successor, Richard Nixon. President Nixon tapped then Governor of Michigan, George Romney, the post of Secretary of Housing and Urban Development. While serving as governor, Secretary Romney had successfully campaigned for ratification of a state constitutional provision and prohibit discrimination in housing. President Nixon also appointed Samuel Simmons as the first Assistant Secretary for Equal Housing Opportunity. When April 1969 arrived, Housing Urban Development could not wait to celebrate the Act's first anniversary. Within that inaugural year, Housing Urban Development completed the Title VIII Field of Operations Handbook. Instituted a formalized complaint process. In truly festive fashion, Housing Urban Development hosted a gala event in the Grand Ballroom of New York's Plaza Hotel. From across the nation, advocates and politicians shared in this marvelous evening, including one of the organizations that started it all, the National Committee Against Discrimination in Housing. In subsequent years, the tradition of celebrating Fair Housing Month grew larger and larger. Governors began to issue proclamations that designed April as Fair Housing Month, and schools across the country sponsored poster and essay contests and focused upon their housing issue. Regional winners from these contests often enjoyed trips to Washington, D.C. for events with the Housing Urban Development and their congressional representatives. Under former Secretary Secretaries James T. Lynn and Carla Hills, with the cooperation of the National Association of Home Builders, National Association of Realtors, and the American Advertising Council. These groups adopted fair housing as their theme and provided free billboard space throughout the nation. These large 20-foot by 14-foot billboards placed the fair housing message in neighborhoods, industrial centers, urban regions, and urban cores. Every region also had its own celebrations, meetings, dinners, contests, and radio television shows that featured housing urban development. State and private fair housing experts and officials. These celebrations continued the spirit behind the original passage of the Act and are remembered fondly by those who were there from the beginning. Thank you.
Martin Luther King Jr. was an activist and political philosopher, best known for his contributions to the Civil Rights Movement, which began in the late 1940s and ended in the late 1960s. Just to refresh any of those who need it, the Civil Rights Movement aimed for fairness. It was a demand for equality, but more specifically, people were fighting to destroy racial segregation, which was legalized, and also end the allowed and generally supported discrimination. So desegregation and basic American citizen rights were allowed to African Americans. Overall, the movement had been a success, despite those who continued to harbor anger in their hearts and hate in their souls. Of course, racism had not been abolished. It was just no longer legalized. Racism as an ideology and social problem has an extremely long history and is still prevalent today, in the dark and in the light, in various different forms. The Emancipation Proclamation, which was issued by the president of the time, Abraham Lincoln, during 1862, declaring the freedom of slaves. From this point, laws were placed to keep African Americans under control without it being considered slavery, as slavery was no longer allowed. A lot of people fail to realize or only share the general achievements of Dr. King, but to specifically name a way he pushed towards equality, he has shared speeches regarding fair and affordable housing, as well as private discussions with higher-ups. After slavery, thousands of millions of African Americans moved from the rural areas of the South to urban areas throughout the North and West. Majority of these African Americans remained in these poor areas with poor housing conditions, living in these areas with little opportunity. It created a barrier between them and success. It wasn't fair because them ending up there was not necessarily their choice, and they didn't have the power to make the deep changes required to allow movement forward. The Chicago Freedom Movement, or the Chicago Open Housing Movement, led by Dr. King, started on 1965 and ended a year later. The aim was to address the issues of great racial tension and the inequality in Chicago. Those standing with Dr. King advocated for fair housing, improved education, and better job opportunities. Bringing more attention to and highlighting the racial disparities in order to push for legislative changes was done by utilizing nonviolent protest tactics, including marches, boycotts, and demonstrations. Pressure needed to be placed on public officials and institutions so that political and social changes could be brought about. One notable event of the Chicago Freedom Movement would be the Marquette Park March in 1966. Thousands of protesters marched through a predominantly white neighborhood to draw attention to the housing discrimination and to confront racial prejudice. Though this march was peaceful, the response was negative. Hostility and violence from some of the white residents that lived there. However, negotiations with city officials and community leaders were made to address the demands for fair housing and racial equality. Agreements were secured with the city, the Chicago Open Housing Movement included. All goals were not achieved at once, but the movement was still a success. The Chicago Freedom Movement was important to the Civil Rights Movement as it helped pave ways for more changes to be made. Martin Luther King Jr. was a black man himself in a time where he was seen as inferior alongside all of the other African Americans. Still, despite his position, his thought process and his way with words provided him with the ability to influence the masses. He may not have had the right to vote or the general rights white American citizens had, but the power in his voice.
Thank you, Brianna. I'd like to thank everyone who has participated in this contest today. All the young people, the older people, everyone online who has been here today, who have watched and listened to our contest. Learned a lot just by sitting here, listening and watching. And what I understand is that it's not me, it's we. It's something that we all will have to strive for, because when we build each other up, everyone rises. Okay? I would like to close with prayer. Let us pray. Dear Lord, watch over each and every one here today at Light Street and online. Watch over their friends, their relatives, and each person they come in contact with. Because we want them to grow in their hearts the love of Jesus Christ, where each person that they would meet and they would touch, that they would see Christ inside them. On this weekend of Dr. Martin Luther King, let us understand that all of us have a part in making this world better. Whether you're 6 months old or 600 years old, you have a part because you, Lord, put us on this earth for your vision. So let us understand why we're here. We're here for all of us. And let that continue in our lives from this day on. Thank you, and God bless. Amen. Thank you, everyone.
Concludes our program. Please greet each other and join us for refreshments, and thank you so much for being here.